Greetings, everybody hear me? This is Bev Tyler, and we also have with us Donna Smith and Lindsay Stewart Goldberg, and we'll answer any of your questions about spies or the spies exhibit or our video that's on the Culper Day. Thank you, Marty. And we had a question from from Catherine Kirkpatrick, who's the author of Red Coats and Petticoats. And basically, it was about Anna Smith Strong and the Manor of St. George. Well, Anna Smith Strong was born in the Manor of St. George, and her father lost the property and the estate, including the manor, uh, through bad investments. And and during the war, uh, the man who had bought it, um, Mr. Seaton, was a Tory. So he fled to New York City with his wife. So the manor was kind of empty because at the time that Anna Smith Strong, or Anna Smith, married Sheila Strong, they were living at the Strongs compound, which is basically on what is now Belterre, or was at the time Drown. No, it's just above Drown Meadow. Um, old man's, old man's. Um, anyway, they soon, during 1776, they moved to, especially after the British took control of Long Island, they moved back to the Strong estate on Strong's Neck to protect the property um, because the British being there and the manor being the best house in the town of Brookhaven. So they moved back there. But the British had taken over the Strong Manor as their one of their local headquarters because it's the best house in the town of Brookhaven. So they were there, all the officers and everything. So Anna Smith, um, we don't know if she actually went to the manor initially. She probably did. But once the British took it over as their headquarters, she basically moved to her servants' quarters down by Little Bay, which was right across the bay from Abraham Woodhouse' home. So that was also convenient for her becoming a spy later, 2 years later. Well, anyway, so the British officers are living in the manor after sometime after August of 76. And she and her husband and their children really don't get back into the manor, uh, owning it, running it, until the end of the war. So all during the war, she's at another location in her servants' quarters, barns, other parts of the area of Strong's Neck that she was living on. So she could easily, once the Revolutionary uh, War spies started in 1778, she could easily communicate with Abraham Woodhull across Little Bay by rigging her supposed, at least we folklore, by folklore, clothesline. And there were other ways for her to contact Abraham Woodhull. She could row across. She could get on her horse and wagon and drive around to Little Bay to meet with him. have supper with. They were their closest neighbors. There wasn't anybody else on the approach to Strong's Neck. Was all the farm of Abraham Woodhull. On Strong's Neck was just the home of the Strong family, and then of course the British during the war. But there were no neighbors, none. It was all farmland. So Anna Smith Strong, when she stayed on Long Island during the Revolutionary War, her closest neighbor was Abraham Woodhull. So there's nobody else around there. So she basically stayed at the servants' quarters, going back and forth between the manor house to serve the British officers because they wanted a lot of stuff. You know, they wanted wine, they wanted food, they wanted silverware, they wanted tablecloths, they wanted bedding, all that kind of thing that they expected Anna Smith Strong and the Strong family to provide them with the things that they didn't have. So during the Revolutionary War, Anna Smith Strong would write out the list of the things that the British officers wanted, and she gave it to Austin Rowe. And it was one of his excuses for going to New York City and gathering supplies, not only for his tavern, but also for the British officers who were living sort of high on the hog at the manor, at the St. George's Manor on Strong's Neck. So, kind of the British officers were making it easy for Austin Rowe to go into New York City, ostensibly to get supplies for his tavern and for them, have all that stuff sent out by ship, and then he'd just ride back to Setauket with the secret messages and coded messages, invisible ink messages, to get to General Washington about what was going on in New York City. The general was doing that. Very simple, very easy, no big deal. Except the fact that Austin Rowe and Robert Townsend in New York City and Anna Smith Strong and Abraham Woodhull, all of the time between August of 1776 and the end of the war in 1783, they were in enemy territory. Very dangerous. Okay, we have another question. Donna's going to give me a question. Someone named Chance Campbell Denny said, I'd love to learn more about Fort Nonsense, but there is very little information about it. Well, you're not going to get much from me because I really have not done much to get information about Fort Nonsense. I think you're talking about the fort that was in Port Jefferson. And yeah, going to have to uh, search um, other sources. I believe that some of the people who came over here to attack were from Rhode Island, so that might be a good place to start, or the Connecticut Archives. Or you can send me an email to bevtyler@aol.com. That's BEVTYLER at AOL.com, and I'll see what I can find on it after Culper Day. Okay? Thank you. Sorry, can't give you more information. Behind me are the codes that Talmadge made. It's 4 pages, and that's the entire code. And it's 4 pages, and you can see it on the wall here. And that's what they used to make coded messages. Um, the invisible ink, of course, was different, but they did both coded messages and invisible ink. Ah, another question. Christine asks, hello, Bev. Are there any monuments or commemorations of the CSR? Confederate? Oh, oh, Copper Spy I thought you were talking about the Confederate States. Are there any monuments or commemorations of the Culper Spy Ring in Washington, D.C.? Maybe the Smithsonian or etc. Well, the only thing that I know is the International Spy Museum in Washington, which is not part of the Smithsonian. It's a separate organization completely, but it's a fun place to go. And you can learn all about spying. They even have 007's car in the museum. And there are, when you bring kids to that museum, they can actually crawl up in the air ducts in the museum and listen to conversations going on below them and become their own spies. So it's a very fun place to be. The International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. That's the only one I know. I don't know of any specific monuments to the Copper Spies. Huh. Oh, yes, also. Um, Mount Vernon, Washington's home, has lots of information about the Culper Spies and about George Washington during, before, and after the Revolutionary War. It's one of the absolute best places to visit, and it has one of the best websites that anybody has done in the entire United States. So take a look at the website for Mount Vernon, Washington's home. Oh, we got more to add, okay. Christine also just asked, would you please consider showing us around the Historical Society? Are there more primary documents behind you? Oh, yeah, we'll do that. Why don't we do that, okay? And I can be assisted by Donna and by Lindsay. I'm going to turn this around. Uh-oh, I lost it. Hmm. Oh, it went. Oh, here I am. Okay. Don't forget that you're plugged in. Yeah, I'll unplug. Okay. Here's Donna and Lindsay. Okay. And what we've got up here is Talmadge's code, 4 pages about the code. About 800 different words used. One of the recipes we have, oh, by the way, those are all in the Library of Congress, loc.gov. And you can actually download them, and they're all free. And this is a letter which we have a transcription of. And the transcription is here. And it's one of the letters written by Abraham Woodhouse to Benjamin Talmadge. And it basically says, let's see if I can get it on the screen here. There we go. Oops. Hey, Bill. Yeah. Just so you know, they can't hear you clearly and move the computer around. Can you hear me now? All right. Let me go back to the other method.
hear you.
Okay. All right. Let's go. Let's go into the main room. This is this is the main this is the main room with our exhibit spies. And what you're looking at is Abraham Woodhouse costume that was worn by Jamie Bell in the AMC Turn series. It was donated by AMC to the Historical Society. And it's not real colonial costume, it's a TV costume. So it's not made out of colonial material. But it looks just like something that would have been worn during that time period. Over here, we have the story of the spy ring and how it originated in New York City. Um, and you can see the map of Long Island there. And the route that Austin Road took out to Setauket. We have an actor playing Austin Rowe. We have the invisible ink message that was written by uh, Robert Townsend and included right here is the where the invisible ink was written, and the reagent to bring out the invisible ink was was written here. And when the reagent was brushed across the page to bring out the invisible ink message, it darkened the page because it wasn't supposed to last 250 years or so. So it darkened the page, and we can no longer see the invisible ink. I can see a couple of words there, but the rest of the message, which was sent out by Austin Rowe, if he'd been stopped, of course, there's no invisible ink as before this reagent was added. So it was just a message to loyalist Colonel Benjamin Floyd in Setauket, and nobody would have paid any attention to it. So that's how that was. We have another question.
Do you want me to read it to you guys, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Karen asks, can you speak about the intelligence coming after the Revolutionary War was his book, Here Service and Progress. And he wrote the entry called Just Once He Felt Compelled to Break His Self-Imposed Sentence in order to honor the memory of the sacrifices made by his friends. Does that mean he outed himself as a spy?
No, no, he
I
didn't.
thought they never spoke about it.
No, he didn't out himself as a spy. What he did was he was talking about. I've lost it again. On. There we go. Benjamin Talmadge served in Congress for 18 years, 9 terms in Congress as a congressman from Connecticut, from Litchfield area. And he never spoke about the spies during the Revolutionary War. What he did speak about was the 3 men who captured John Andre. Those 3 men appealed to Congress for additional funds. They wanted Congress to pay them and honor them for capturing John Andre. And basically, what Benjamin Talmadge said was they were just as liable to turn him back over to the British as he was to the Americans. They were just opportunists, that they saw a chance to make a little bit of money or uh, good information for themselves by turning him over to the Americans. They weren't a bit interested in doing the right thing. And Talmadge uh, had interactions with them during the time that uh, Andre, that he recaptured Andre, and he was eventually hung. So he wasn't a bit interested in these three men gaining any additional compensation. In fact, he very strongly stated his opposition to that while he was in Congress. And that's the only thing that he mentioned, that, but he never mentioned anything about the spies. Everybody knew that he was the head of the uh, organization. He was the head of Washington's Secret Service. And everybody knew that Caleb Brewster was a captain in the Continental Army, an artillery officer, and a whaleboat captain, and went back and forth across Long Island, uh, gaining the messages for General Washington. Everybody knew that. But so, you know, but Talmadge never talked about it. Another question?
Well, I mean, it's sort of common.
Okay.
I think it just wants to say, online, in South Carolina, thank you, for this, talk and for the virtual tour. And for the Talmadge Island, my husband eager to see the 10 Greek overlooking sites as space vacation sites.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Okay. Let's go back into the other room. Show you a couple more things. Here you see a map. The three.
Eleanor wants to know about Hercules Mulligan. Oh, and closer to the mic.
Okay, speak closer to the mic. Okay. Eleanor wants to hear about Hercules Mulligan. There are a number of books written about Hercules Mulligan. Um, one is a novel, and another one that's available is mostly a historical writing about him. But we don't know a lot about him. We do know that he was a good friend and classmate at the college in New York, which is now, uh, yeah, but the college, King's College, right? Yeah, King's College in New York City. Now, um, huh? Now Columbia, yeah, I believe that. Um, but they were good friends in college. And when the war started, of course, Hamilton was in the army, and Hercules Mulligan was a tailor by trade. So he stayed in New York City as a tailor, both during the time that the Americans under General Washington were in New York City, and then when the British took it over. And because his leanings were toward the Patriots, he started correspondence with Robert Townsend in New York, uh, as well as getting messages to General Washington through Townsend. And Hercules Mulligan actually had a slave. His name was Cato. And Cato was a black slave of Hercules Mulligan. And the way we understand it is that Cato would take messages to Robert Townsend. So actually, Cato was the communication between Robert Townsend and Hercules Mulligan. And they all lived fairly close to each other in lower Manhattan. So the messages were easy to pass from one to the other. Also, Hercules Mulligan is a featured character in the play on Broadway, Hamilton, once the play opens again. All right? Got another question.
Megan asks, hi Bev, who did the dress you wearing before?
The what?
The dress.
Oh, the dress. It's just a recreated dress that some of the women here have used as a costume. It's not from that time period, but it's the cut and the fabric and the way in which it's put together is the same as they would have done in the colonial period. From Christine.
Christine asks, is there any marker in Lower Manhattan where Townsend's family lived?
Is there any marker in Lower Manhattan where Townsend? Um, well, I took one of the New York City walks with the experts who were in New York City, and they pointed out where Robert Townsend's shop would have been, and where Hercules Mulligan's shop would have been, and a number of others. But there were no identifications on the buildings that I know of, and there was no signage that we saw down there. The best way to find out is to take one of the walks that are done on a regular basis in New York City. I'm not sure if they're going on during the pandemic now, but they were doing the walks of Lower Manhattan and the Spy Tour on a regular basis um, for years uh, before the pandemic. So just keep an eye on that and see if they start up again. And they're very interesting, and you learn a lot about everything that happened in Lower Manhattan during the Revolutionary War. Great, great tours. Where? Whose store? Oh, um, that's what we're talking about. No, no, there's just nothing there. Yeah, yeah, they're in Peck Slip area, but it's it's the tour guides are just wonderful, and they give you all kinds of information about Lower New York City during the Revolutionary War. It's a great place to visit and to see all about the spies and all the people that operated there during the Revolutionary War.
There's a comment, Jennifer just asked if I need to repeat the questions because nobody can hear.
Oh, okay. I'll make sure I repeat the questions. I thought I was. Huh. Hello, Jennifer. I'll show you something else. Here is a Library of Congress geography, and it shows operated.
Beth, I have a couple of questions for you.
Couple more questions, okay?
All right. So the first question I have is who wants to know how Nathan was caught in the story of his execution?
Nathan Hale. Okay, we'll go in this other room and talk about Nathan Hale.
Okay. Beth, I do have a book recommendation.
Okay,
So for Nathan Hale, there's a book by William Phelps, who did a biography about Nathan Hale.
that's good. Phelps by Nathan, about Nathan Hale. Now, on 15 September, on this, 1776, Hale was rowed across Long Island Sound to the area now called Haleside, in the town of Rivington, and he walked toward New York City. I'm going to go back and sit down, and we're going to talk about Nathan Hale. We lose the connection, okay. Okay. Nathan Hale was an officer in the Continental Army and the only one to volunteer on a mission from General Washington to find out what the British were planning. They controlled Long Island, but they didn't have New York City at the time. At the time. So Washington asked for a volunteer, and Hale volunteered, went across onto Long Island, masquerading as a school teacher, looking for work, and he walked all the way into New York City. He wasn't a good spy. He's good looking. He talks a lot. He's very friendly. Everybody likes him. And so he stood out, and they very soon discovered who he was. I mean, way before he got into New York City, because he was asking too many questions. And he gets into New York City, and the British are already there. So all the information that he was supposed to gather about what the British were doing on Long Island and when they were going to attack New York City was too late. So instead of hiding and finding a way to get back to the American lines, he kept asking questions and walked all the way back to Huntington, where Robert Rogers, one of the British uh, Queen's Rangers and a spy hunter, captured him, took him into New York City, gave him to General Howe, and General Howe hung him the next day as a spy. He admitted that he was a spy. So unfortunately, Um, Nathan Hale was our first failed spy. But because of the information that Nathan Hale um, was supposed to gather and his appreciation by everyone that they hung an officer in the Continental Army, he became a reason for people to join the Continental Army. A lot of people, when enlistments were supposed to be up at the end of December 1776, a lot of people re-upped, and a lot of others joined the Continental Army because they were so mad about what the British did by hanging Nathan Hale, a very popular officer in the Continental Army. From Helen, a question. Okay, Helen wants to know what was the most vital contribution that the co-perspiring made. Well, Helen, it wasn't the fact that the co-perspiring let Washington know that the British were going to attack the French fleet and troops before they got settled in Newport, Rhode Island, which was important. It wasn't the fact that Robert Townsend, through the co-perspiring, let Washington know that the British were planning to flood the area with fake continental dollars, which would have destroyed any value that they had. It wasn't that. And it wasn't the capture of Benedict Arnold by Benjamin Talmadge, which was partly due to Robert Townsend telling Benjamin Talmadge to keep an eye out for somebody named, now I've forgotten the name. Now I'll think of it. But that wasn't important. The important thing that the co-perspiring did for spying was that they gave Washington accurate information about what was going on in New York City and on Long Island and along and through Long Island Sound. Washington came to rely on the information that the co-perspiring provided. It wasn't always timely. Sometimes it was after the fact. But Washington soon came to realize that a lot of his spies were giving him information uh, that they thought, in the way in which they thought he would want it, or the way in which would make them look good, but not giving him very accurate and detailed information. And the co-perspiring did that. Of course, co-perspiring members, aside from Robert Townsend, were all from Setauket, Long Island. And since Benjamin Talmadge, the head of Washington's Secret Service, was from Setauket, they weren't going to tell him stuff that wasn't true or that might be something to make them look good. They were going to give him very accurate, good information. That's what they did. And Washington came to rely on it so much that a couple of times he asked Talmadge to verify information he's received from other spies from the co-perspiring. So the co-perspiring was the best source of information, even if it wasn't always timely. But Washington came to rely on them because he knew that whatever he was getting from the co-perspiring was accurate. Sometimes it was too much information. He even complained about that. He said Abraham Woodhull was giving him too much information, but Woodhull never stopped doing that.
So, Barbara just asked,
Uh, yes, John Anderson, absolutely. And my wife, Barbara, usually helps me out with all kinds of information because my head doesn't store it all at one time. John Anderson was a name that came through to Robert Townsend, probably from his home in Oyster Bay. He got the information somehow, possibly from his sister, that John Anderson was a spy's name, not the real name, but the fake name that he would use. And keep an eye out for somebody using the name John Anderson. So um, when the spy for Benedict Arnold um, used the name John Anderson, then it was immediately obvious to Benjamin Talmadge that this was a spy for the British. And so he arrested John Andre. Ah, yes, we've got a good book that we want you to consider, and that is a very wonderful book by a man named Nathaniel Philbrick, who's written a lot of wonderful books on the Revolutionary era and actually other books um, about American history. The book we're recommending is Valiant Ambition. Valiant Ambition by Nathaniel Philbrick. Uh, it's about Washington and Benedict Arnold and Washington's relationship with Benedict Arnold. Wonderful book.
Megan asks, can you please talk about what you know about James Rivington's involvement with the whole thing?
Who is?
Megan?
Megan. Megan wants to know what was uh, Robert Townsend's, uh,
James Rivington's.
oh, I'm sorry, James Rivington's um, work with the Culper Spire. Well, James Rivington's an interesting character, and he's hard to pin down because he's an active Tory um, and he's an active patriot later in the war. Basically, James Rivington was a uh, writer and a publisher in New York City. Um, during the time that Washington was there, he was a patriot. When General Howe took over Washington from George Washington, suddenly, and when uh, General Clinton took over from General Howe, James Rivington is suddenly a loyalist, and he's writing Rivington's Royalist Gazette, sometimes called Rivington's Loyalist Gazette. And he's putting all kinds of stories about how terrible Washington is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometime during the time that the British occupied New York, Rivington seems to have realized how terrible the British were, how terrible they were treating both the supposed patriots in New York City and the loyalists in New York City. And he became a spy for Robert Townsend. He was running his print shop and his newspaper in lower New York, and he got to be friends with Robert Townsend. How, I'm not sure, but he got to be friends with him. And actually, as far as we know, Robert Townsend contributed funds to help uh, Rivington start a coffee house in the same area that he ran the print shop. And that coffee house became a place to get information um, since it was occupied most of the time by British soldiers and officers and other people. You could listen to what was going on and get information about what the British were doing. And that information was given to Robert Townsend. And actually, at the end of the war, one of the things that Washington did was he sent Benjamin Talmadge in early to protect the spies, the people in New York City who the residents considered as loyalists, who were actually spying for the Revolutionary War. And Washington and Talmadge wanted to protect these men and women from retribution by the people in New York City once the British left, who were going to attack them. And the next morning, Washington actually, as far as we know, had breakfast with Robert Townsend to show that he was one of the people that needed to be protected, that he was actually a patriot. Um, didn't always work as well as they'd like, but at least he wasn't, his print shop wasn't uh, destroyed, and he wasn't killed by the people in New York City or forced to leave New York City because of that.
And so Maddie has a question. Do you know if Rivington Street in Lower Manhattan is named after James Rivington?
Know is what?
If Rivington Street in Lower Manhattan is named after James Rivington.
Is Marty wants to know if Rivington Street in Lower Manhattan is named after James Rivington. I don't know. Um, it's very possible, but it's a large family, so that would be something to ask some of the people who give the tours down there, or possibly the New York Historical Society would be a good source of information. They have a lot of information on the Revolutionary War and Lower Manhattan during that time period.
And I have a question from Sandy. And Sandy asks, as in the opinion of the describes it, the Nathan Hale hanging motivated Talmadge to kill his family.
Did Nathan Hale's hanging um, encourage uh, Talmadge to join the spy ring? Yes and no. I mean, they were good friends. They both attended Yale. They both graduated in 1773 and went to work as school teachers in Connecticut. And they were best friends. They were best friends in college and after. And of course, um, the death of Talmadge's brother, older brother, at the hands of the British in after the Battle of Long Island, also um, gave Talmadge the idea of being part of that. And of course, yes, Nathan Hale, his hanging, did as well. But Talmadge was in a unique position, and he was a resident of Long Island before he joined the Continental Army. And in February of 1777, about quite a few months before the spy ring uh, began in August of 1778. Back in February of 1777, there was a spy operating on Long Island. And this spy um, was providing information, probably through Caleb Brewster and his whaleboats, going back and forth between Setauket and um, Fairfield, Connecticut. And there wasn't anyone controlling this particular spy. So Washington asked Talmadge to run the spy. In other words, to be the contact between this spy and himself. So that kind of got Talmadge started in being a spy and coordinating the actions of spies. And so between February of 1777 and September of 1777, Talmadge was the person who had the contact back and forth with this spy on Long Island and in New York City. So he did a good job at it. So naturally, when uh, they needed someone to be part of the intelligence service, uh, in addition to his job as a dragoon officer, Washington asked Talmadge to work with his head of intelligence at the time, General Scott. And then when General Scott retired, uh, it was natural. By this time, Talmadge was a major in the Continental Army. It was quite normal then for Washington to say to Talmadge, would you be the head of my intelligence service? And he was from then on. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question, another comment.
Jean Marie just wanted to say she's a descendant from Nathan Hale.
Who did?
Jean Marie.
Jean Marie is a descendant from Nathan Hale. You know, we have a lot of descendants of Nathan Hale and all of the Culper spies um, on Long Island. So there's lots of people who are descended from Caleb Brewster, from Robert, not from Robert Townsend. He only had one child by his housekeeper, but a lot of descendants of all different of the spies, the Brewsters, the Woodhouse, uh, the Rose, all still occupy Long Island and are part of all over the country. So I think now it's 1:54, and I think it's time we wrapped up this live edition of Spies. Be sure to remember that the Three Village Historical Society Spies exhibit will open sometime. We're not sure when, but keep an eye on our website, www.tvhs.org. We have this whole weekend of Culper Day, and then on Monday, we have a live lecture program on that I'm actually doing on the eel catching, it's a talking, history, the African American Setauket African American Christian Avenue community. It'll be about a half an hour in length with question and answers at the end. We have many other live programs coming up during the rest of the year this year. So keep tuned to www.tvhs.org for all of the live programs and all of our video programs. And we're actually even doing video school programs as well. So have a good day, and thank you. Thank you all for being part of our live production on the Three Village Historical Society Culper Day in Setauket, Stony Brook, and Port Jefferson.